Welcome back, everyone. This is the next edition of what I have been calling Overcoming Cultural Divides and Differences. But in talking to my guest for today, Jerry White, we were chatting beforehand that that might be a bit ambitious. I mean, can we really overcome the cultural differences that our society is facing these days? And Jerry said maybe we're thinking more of navigating cultural divides and differences. And I like that idea. We're at least going to go with it today, and I will consider whether I can change the name of this over time or not. But I think I'm probably going to, because I think that it is probably too much to be thinking of overcoming, but we do still need to figure out how to navigate. And what the premise of what this year-long series has been is how we can use various what I call cultural artifacts of music, film, sports, literature, food. You'll be hearing about this more in January, but there was a great, or a fun, I shouldn't call great fun article in the New York Times shortly before the election, where they had 50 photographs of refrigerators. You had to guess whether the refrigerator was from a Trump supporter or a Biden supporter. And my family all took it, and of course we failed miserably. And that was part of the point, that the Times said everybody else does too. And so, I mean, there are even things of the selection of the food we make and the preparations of them that might cross some cultural divides. One of those cultural artifacts is religion, which may seem to be a non-starter. I mean, good grief, if there's anything that causes distrust and even violence and animosity, it's our religious beliefs, right? Well, we'd like to tiptoe our way into talking about it a little bit more with that with Jerry today. Jerry, if you went to a Wikipedia website and see who Jerry is, it would say Jerry White activist, which he certainly is. He's an activist. He's been at it for a long time. In fact, his campaign to ban landmines ended up resulting in him being the co-recipient of the 1997 Nobel Peace Prize and him working with Princess Diana. Not too long after that, he ended up, he's a graduate of Brown University and also the University of Michigan, which is where I met him, because he was a student in the last executive MBA class that I taught before I left Michigan to go to George Washington University. He won the Nobel before I taught him, so I can't claim any credit for having inspired a student or anything like that. He got that first. But when I moved to DC, I realized that he lived a couple of blocks away and our offices were a couple of blocks away. And so a friendship developed over many cups of coffees and conversations and things like that. And I'm grateful for him to be here today. But in addition to being an activist, he's also run a business. He's also served in the US State Department. He's been in academia, working at Fordham University and currently at the University of Virginia, where he teaches a course of how to stop killing or how to stop violence in the name of God. And that brings us to our subject matter for today. So welcome, Jerry. Glad to have you. And as always, I'm sure we're going to have a great conversation like we always do. And this time everybody gets to listen in on what we have to talk about. So I'd like to start off at your current work at Virginia and the course you teach on combating religious violence. And you've started to use the term, I think you call it religious side. I was wondering if you could just talk about that. I mean, what is religious side and how does it kind of come into the class that you're currently teaching?
Thank you, Professor, for having me on today. Thank you, Tim.
When was the last time you called me Professor?
It's been a while. I thought I'd practice. Have some respect. So yes, it's an honor. Although I'm based in St. Augustine, Florida, which is the oldest city in America, and also one of the scenes of the first religion-related violence, over here with indigenous groups, but also between the Catholics and Protestants and Spanish and British and French, right down here, starting in 1565. So anyway, I teach at the University of Virginia, as you said, a class called Religion, Violence, and Strategy, How to Stop Killing in the Name of God. So I have about 60 students every semester, and we take on really difficult cases to say, like, what is this about violence? Around the world, the good news is violence has been going down. Interstate violence, or most types of violence, have been decreasing over the years. So that's the good news. The bad news is there's this particular strand, which I don't call religious violence, but religion-related violence. And we'll get to that, why. Because it's the fastest growing type of violence around the world. And it turns out when a conflict becomes, as I would say, religified, it becomes harder to solve. because we're talking about God's will and some things that people and followers won't compromise on, sacred morals and values that are at stake, apocalyptic visions of like the end of times and good versus evil. So these particular conflicts rarely start as because of religion. Religion actually has been a source of resilience for the most part around the world. And actually religion is very important in peace building strategies and solving these problems. But most people, if you quiz them, even my students, or maybe some of your listeners, like what's the cause of violence today? And people believe it's religion. They give religion really a bum and bad rap here. But it's not. Conflict comes based on other things that are, greed, competition, resources, like old-fashioned power grabs, right? And competition and retaliations. But then religious groups are enlisted in the service of a conflict. And then, the ethno-religious elements become, more pronounced over time. And then by the time a conflict is fully religified, it is hard to solve. So the word religicide is just something we came up with because we started to see around the world different cases like the Yazidis and the genocide in 2014, as well as the Uyghurs today in China, or the Rohingya out of Myanmar. So our class will take on those, maybe 3 to 6 cases of religion-related violence and try to find strategies of how to interrupt them, disrupt them, prevent them, solve them. And that's why it's also a business class on strategy, basically, because you take on an impossible case, lots of uncertainty and conflict, many factors, multiple stakeholders, very complex. And then you have students who may not have known how to spell Rohingya or Yazidi or Uyghur, the week before, having to tackle these topics. And thinking about the elements of strategy from your values and your vision to choices you're going to make and what you're not going to do, something I learned from you as well in business school, the choices, ethical and otherwise. Aligning the leadership for transformation and systems change. These are all big words, but there's a way to look at strategy when it comes to system innovation and change making over time. And that includes some of these aspects we teach in the class. So when I think of religicide, I'll sum it up and then you can carry forth. I think it's a combination. You start to see this isn't just like genocide, although it's genocidal. And this isn't just, and then you'll see other elements that is just destroying the places where people worship, their literature, their traditions, their community, their people, their children, their women who could bear children. There's so many aspects to it that you start to see they're very belonging, or they're very right of if a religion can have rights, the very right of that religion to survive. So we have in human rights, the protection and dignity and equality for all, but it's largely individual based. And what we're seeing is when you see systematic and systemic abuse, what I call religicide, that will have elements of genocide, trying to wipe out the people, the community, as well as ecocide. It will, destroy like ISIS did in Iraq, start to destroy like all the farmland, all the wells, all the infrastructure, and like poisoning left and right, and ruining farms. So like and chopping down all the trees in an area for military or other purposes. So there's an environmental devastation that takes place when you see religicide, in addition to the, the people devastation. And then you have what I would call suicide, which is sort of it accompanies trauma, collective trauma, and trying to recover. So if, thousands of your women in a religion have been kidnapped by ISIS and enslaved, as sex slaves, and then bearing children to Muslim fathers who were Islamic fighters, the laws say that those children have to be Muslim, in Iraq. So, the Yazidis is an ethno-religious, monotheism, where it's part of the birth line. It's, genetic, and it's part of the tribe. You don't marry outside the tribe. But once you've been forced to, those children, according to law, can't be raised as Yazidis. They have to be Muslims in Iraq. So so you're seeing the depression after coming back from enslavement and having your child or losing, so many family members in the genocide. There's a mass, increase in suicide that's rather understandable, in depression and mental health and trauma recovery issues. And lastly, I would say the fourth characteristic, in addition to genocide, ecocide, and suicide, would be what I call factocide. You have lots of mistruths, like mischaracterization of the Yazidis or whatever group you're talking about. There's always a narrative. In the case of Iraq, based on the history, they're considered and called devil worshippers because they worship like an angel that at one point disobeyed God, and God rewarded that angel for such. So there's 7 angels created, and the lead one was, I guess, rather feisty and refused to bow down to people. So there's a fascinating religion. It might be like a precursor to a pre-Abrahamic monotheism in Nineveh province, like in the sort of, that's their ancestral homeland where, you know, the book of Jonah or the stories in Mesopotamia come from in the Bible. But they aren't people of the book. So we're seeing that we're having so much misinformation about groups, and that happens in time of war as well. You have like digitized, you know, propaganda now, or computerized disinformation. All of that combines to what amounts to what I would call, and this is just a working theory, to find the characteristics of religicide, wanting to wipe out entire people and their land and their, you know, next generations and their books and their traditions, and eradicate it completely.
So as you're talking, Jerry, I fall back to a book that I read, oh gosh, 15 years ago maybe, by Scott Appleby, who was the director of the Kroc Institute for Peace Studies at Notre Dame. And it was a book called The Ambivalence of the Sacred. And one of his arguments was that with any religion, and you know, at the time, and continue today, many people think of terrorism as associated with Islam, but he cast a much wider net of any religion, that when they feel backed into a corner, when the population feels backed into a corner, that they will seize upon a religious text and make the entire meaning of the religion based on that text, and then be able to justify violence in defense of that text, but as a mechanism for defending their entire culture and way of life. Is that similar to what you're thinking of in terms of religious side, or is it coming from a different angle, or any thoughts of how you would relate those?
Yeah, I think it's very important not to, I mean, every religion and great religion has, you know, a history of bloodshed and, you know, guilt and shame on its hands, as well as great things. So when you actually go through the history of religions and how they've manifested in history, you know, even the Buddhists, you know, where we think are more peaceful, are not, you know, in the Rohingya case is rather like, you know, the genocide against the Rohingya is very, very difficult. So you can just dig into history. You don't have to look very far, and you see that violence is there, even from the Genesis and the, you know, beginning of the Hebrew Bible. It's Cain and Abel, and you know, God relents and regrets having made these humans who fight and kill and murder so easily for pretty small things. So that you see that there's violence endemic in the human condition. And one of the things that I found in religion is that you know, it forms a group. Like, people can't survive alone. You survive in groups. Right. So first, think of it as like groupism. You have like a cultural norm. You worship the sun. You come together so that you can define yourself against others, like intruders or other groups. So there's there's us versus them. Mm-hmm. So that brings the seed of this sort of religion, animosity, and potential violence. But it's also part of our evolution for survival, just to exist in groups. So you have your groupism, and then us and them. And then, as you say, under pressure, or like after a couple famines or a couple raids, when people are competing over resources, then making the other the enemy, and then actually evil. And then, you know, like I say, you weaponize scripture to latch on, as you say, to a couple verses that apply to characterizing the other. And therefore, you start committing evil in the name of God. You know, what Jonathan Sachs, the late rabbi, you know, called, you know, pathological dualism becomes altruistic evil. You think you're actually serving God by killing the other.
Right. In one of my earlier vlogs that I did in this series, I talked about the difference between us versus them and us and them. That we all have to have an us. I mean, we're social beings, and we need to have our family or our neighborhood or our team or whatever. It's okay to have an us, and the only way that you know that you have an us, or one way to know, is you know that there is someone else who is not an us, and that's a them. Well, that's one thing, but it's another thing to make the us a versus them, so that the them has become an enemy at that point, as opposed to a different group of people, but not necessarily one with whom or for whom you have animosity toward. And I think that distinction is really an important one, because sometimes, I mean, I I criticize us versus them like everybody else does. I mean, I think that it's a problem, but I mean, it is important to recognize, as you indicate, that we need an us. But it's when that verses come in, that really different kind of verses is the opposition come in, that I think you really get into this difficult demonization that can lead to violence. So, well, I should stop here. This is what happens when Jerry and I talk. We just, one thing leads to another. So in the interest of our audience, let me move
But
to
it does come back to your earlier point of like,
sure.
you don't overcome it. You learn
Right.
to navigate the
Right.
divide. So you will have others, but what is otherism when the other becomes an enemy? So it's really understanding that all is like one. We like biodiversity. When you see fundamentalisms and religions or like monocultures emerge, it's usually not good for biodiversity or the planet or for people. You know, there's such a celebration of diversity throughout creation that is part of celebrating, and religion as well. It's worth celebrating. So these are things that one can learn to respect and understand. And as you learn more about other people's faiths, even ones that you really highly disagree with, you learn more about your own faith and your own group. And the key here is like, you may think I'm going to hell from a particular like sect, and you may think it's like worthy. And I can just disagree with what we're trying to do in reducing violence is to come up with techniques that would be like, you don't have the right to push me into hell in the name of your religion. You don't have the right to kill me. So there's, in Hebrew, you say yesh gvul. There's a boundary to the us versus them. And there are some rules that must be navigated so that we don't have mass violence, genocide, or religicide.
I have a feeling we're moving into the category of the next question, but I'm still learning about what your next category is a little bit, so we'll see. And that is that you've coined another term called transpreneurship. And so can you talk to me a little bit about what that is and how that concept of transpreneurship connects to this notion of navigating cultural divides and differences?
Right. So transpreneurship for me, trans is sort of like this crossing over, and I think of it as like disciplines, sectors, and gifts and abilities and people. So I found that although I'm an Ashoka Fellow and I was dubbed a social entrepreneur rather early, and as you said, I ran a company and started a tech firm. So there's entrepreneurship, we're sort of familiar with that, and then social entrepreneurship, sort of the .org version. But I'm finding that there was different sectors. If you really wanted to produce lasting or sustainable system change, you had to be able to not puppeteer, but navigate and coalesce across sectors. The public sector, .gov, we could call that intrapreneurship. So when I was in the State Department, I could still be entrepreneurial, but it was inside a big system. So whether you're at IBM or at the State Department, that would be intrapreneurship. So we have entrepreneurship, intra, and the .orgs. You also have to learn, as in my social sector background, to navigate the nonprofit industrial complex and all the different NGOs and nonprofits that make up that world, the .org world. And so what is it about them? I call them interpreneurships because no one NGO on its own can really cause system change. They need each other. So when we were in the International Campaign to Ban Landmines, it was 1,200 organizations across transboundary, transdiscipline across 120 countries. So that's again an example of interpreneurship, which is a piece of this. And lastly, as I started to see real leaders struggle with pacing themselves over time, or sort of running low on their spiritual and maybe intellectual capital, they were burning out. So to go the distance in social and sustainable change, which we need in these complex problems, wicked problems we're facing, we need interpreneurship as well. And that's that ability to go in, I call it a spiritual discipline, some call it meditation or breathing, contemplation, but also, almost the monkishness of being a professor and a researcher as well, being able to go so deep inside something. And others find it through like running marathons. So I'm not here to say it's a religious aspect. I'm saying that's closer to the .edu monkish life of refilling your tank intellectually after you've been saying and researching the same thing again and again and again, or doing it, but also learning how to go inside and breathe, the essence of life. So transpreneurship is all four of those, and that's how we're going to raise like mini transformers around the world. We need to train up a rising generation of transpreneurs who are literate in the different sectors and their vocabulary and how they work. These are like different animals at a zoo. you have to, again, know how to navigate them.
Okay. All right. Very good. I didn't know all that before. Now I do. Well,
You
this
see, I
actually.
just like to make up words just when I'm bored, I guess.
Let's move into the third question, because I think that it follows on naturally from it. So, I mean, if we're talking about training up, a group of young people or even old people who want to feel young or want to be engaged or whatever, this is a challenging time in a lot of different ways. I mean, the impetus for doing this whole series this year has been a feeling of real concern, if not fear, of exactly where we are heading as a society, given the differences that we have. In the very first vlog that I did, I held up the cover of the Atlantic, which said, a civil war. And if you get into the magazine for that month, I mean, it kind of pulled back a little bit, but not a lot. I mean, it was metaphorical, but they were saying it's not really metaphorical. I mean, there have been such cultural divides in this country on all kinds of issues, it seems, here in the last few years. And now in the midst of a pandemic, when we are separated from each other, which makes it harder to engage that communal notion. I mean, this is great. It's great that we're able to talk with each other over our computer screens and something like that. I'm glad that we have it, but it's a little bit different than being with each other too. And so if we're thinking of training up, these individuals who are trying to engage in new ways of trying to draw us together, there's going to be defeats. And we may even be starting from a place of where there has been defeats, regardless, depending on where you're coming from. And you have a long history of writing about things like resilience and determination and overcoming obstacles that go back to your personal history. When the reason that you started the landmine was after you had lost a leg after having stepped on a landmine. I was wondering if you can just reflect on your experience, your work and your writing on resiliency and fighting back and overcoming, of how individuals who are listening to this, I mean, it's fine to say the government should do X, the government should do Y, or maybe business should do X or business should Y. But I really believe that it's a lot easier for business and government to do whatever they're supposed to do if citizens are doing something that might help them along the way, that can provide them a foundation so that they can engage with each other in a more civil way, in a more cooperative way, in a constructive way. But given the fact that we're going to lose sometimes and we're going to suffer sometimes, what would be your advice to people who are listening of, how to take on a challenge like that?
Great question. I think these tough problems are not going to go away, and every epoch and generation faces theirs individually. So as you alluded to, when I was 20, I took my junior year abroad from Brown University and went to study in Israel and to walk in the footsteps of the prophets. And I was a religious studies and poli-sci major. And I had no idea that the Holy Land was such a deadly land, because there were about 1 million landmines, unbeknownst to me, left over from past wars that were still buried underground. So I went camping with 2 friends, and lo and behold, found my landmine, stepped on one, and lost my lower right leg. I spent 6 months in a hospital in Israel. So that was the beginning of first discovering my own personal resilience in the face of traumatic, a before and after moment, as we say. But there are a lot of before and after moments that the world faces as well. Anniversaries of wars, as you've alluded to, 9/11 in America. I think now 2020 is going to be, with the pandemic, again, one of those before and after moments that's sort of an epic. So you ask ourselves individually, personally, as well as collectively, how do we build resilience? Or I like to call it like, how do you live, let's say, moving from victim experience or victimhood. Many are victimized, but if you catch the disease of victimhood, that's problematic. And many of our leaders will stoke the fears and the illness of victimhood in politics. So you have to listen to a type of language. So victims, when you see this around the world, the language is usually living in the past, number one. Also, there's this sort of self-pitying tone to it. resentment of others and other groups, blaming others, taking no responsibility yourself, as well as an insatiability. It's almost like an addict. If you're caught victimhood and you're addicted to it, then you'll always be a taker. You're not a giver. You don't see a lot of humor or generosity in the victim space. That said, I'm saying victimhood. We aren't blaming victims or survivors of the most horrific atrocities around the world. If they just stood on their head and sucked their thumb and didn't do anything, there is no judgment. But I'm saying socially, you can see these trends of what's healthy for society. If you want to move from a victimhood state to survivorship, you need these steps of resilience. And after studying maybe 10,000 war victims around the world and survivors, I wrote a book called Getting Up When Life Knocks You Down. And the 5 secret steps or ingredients to resilience that was borne out by the thousands of survivor stories, as well as literature and research, were number 1, face facts. Like, COVID's here, I can't go out, or I don't, and also face the feelings of the facts. I don't like wearing masks, but I should, or I'm dying here. I'm disassociating from my friends. I'm in a house or domestic situation that is not healthy. That just talking to Americans and all the students, for example, this isn't the campus experience they want. Fact. And the feelings are facts as well. And this sucks. So for me, losing a leg was my fact. My leg is not growing back. I'm not a starfish, as I say. My hair's not growing back. It's fact. And you might be over time, you have to wrestle with those facts. And that's the breakthrough of denial. So the first step is actually the hardest one, and every now and then you have to go back and remember the facts of your case. I need a fake leg, and I need one every 3 years or so to walk and be highly functional. Without a fake leg, or if I didn't have money or insurance to buy one, that's very distressing as well, because then I feel much more disabled and incapacitated on crutches and much more vulnerable. But the second for all of us to consider even is just, so therefore it sucks, now choose life. Just because this year might be annus horribilis, as the Queen said once, it doesn't mean you're defined. Like a big oak tree, and you cut the trunk and you see there are some darker circles, but there are many circles. So not being defined by this one bad experience or your bad year requires you to dig deep and reach for hope. And that's also choosing life, is knowing that you're more than your trunk or your body. The people who have spirituality, in a sense, the studies show, have a competitive advantage in survivorship and living positively in the face of disease and disaster. So number 1, face facts. Number 2, choose life. 3 is reaching out. For as we talked about earlier, no one survives or succeeds alone, whether in business or we need community. We're social animals. So you need to reach out and be reached out to. When you're in trauma, the temptation is for all of us to go deeper into our shell, like turtledom, just go in with withdraw. But it's exactly at the time where you have to reach out and you must stay connected, because isolation will make victimhood worse. And then number 4, it's, physical and being in action, get moving. You have to do your rehab. I can't do it for you. No one could do it for me. I had to learn how to walk in a leg. Even in a country rebuilding after war, this isn't a passive exercise. Life is not passive. It is really moving. And I remember the first time I got in a wheelchair, for example, in the hospital, a nurse looked down, I thought she was going to just wheel me to the cafeteria for lunch. And she looked down at me and smiled and said, if you want to move, push. It was on me, not I wasn't going to be taken care of. I had to now navigate barriers, and also with a wheelchair. So that was new and different. So face facts, choose life, reach out, get moving. And the 5th step is the secret sauce, I would say, which is the opposite of victimhood. It's generosity. So 5, give back. So even in small or big ways, even you don't expect someone who's in a hospital bed to be a huge giver in all that pain. However, sometimes it's a piece of humor. Sometimes it's, not being so rude to your caregiver, even though you're in a lot of pain. There are little ways where generosity manifests, and then there are bigger ways of reaching out to others going through worse situations. And we're wired for giving, as it's food, sex, sleep, and giving, altruism, that boost our serotonin or our mood levels. So if you're trying to think well, I'm in a bad mood, you might start with the easiest, some level of generosity and giving. And that's what we want to see in our leaders, right? The good news after all of this, Tim, is that, that recipe is that these are things you can do and be in shape for. You can raise a more resilient family, more resilient community, you collectively and individually, and for yourself, you can go through these things and say, like, oh, these are the practices. And the studies from Yale and Mount Sinai School of Medicine also attest to this. Like, these are having a moral compass, social, belonging, having a spiritual discipline, whatever, studying and coaching. There are things that actually, back to our first topic, where religion and religious groups traditionally provided the setting, the groupishness to survive together. So really, resilience is a rather social dynamic, and we need it to survive together.
As you're talking, Jerry, I'm thinking that it'll be 25 years that my wife and I have been married, and she's always worked with addiction counseling and working with the homeless. And if I've heard her say once, I have heard her say 10,000 times to or report that she had advised this to clients, find a volunteer activity to do, reach out and do something that you'll feel so much better about yourself, and it will help your rehabilitation. And you just captured that, particularly in that last step, that it's so easy when you go through adversity to go back in with yourself and just silo and just the turtle syndrome, as you put it. But that really resonated with me when you were talking about reach out and volunteer or contribute or do something with a generous spirit, that it helps you by being generous to others. And that's something that I really think. I was doing a presentation yesterday for a local group here, and one of them asked, how do we get through the holidays, given all of the animosity and hurt that some people have, and how do you talk to the uncle who is really upset about what's happened? And I said, one thing that I would just suggest, maybe talk about some of these cultural artifacts of, have a common ground with the music that you like, or your dog, or all those kind of small talk starters. But why don't you say, tell to the person that you disagree with, for 10 minutes, I know that you're not happy right now. I know that your views are completely different than mine. I'm going to be quiet for 10 minutes and let you talk. Just tell me why you believe what it is you believe. And I really believe that if you did that the other person would turn around and say, okay, you take your 10 minutes. But it's that simple step of being willing to give your time in order to listen. That's one of those things that I think can break down some of the barriers that we have. Now, that can be difficult to do because you may think that the other person belongs on Pluto or whatever, but at the same time, you had said earlier, when we were talking about religion, sometimes people may fiercely disagree with each other and still be able to find bonds of ways to communicate with each other, even because they recognize that there is a sincerity of the person's belief. And I've done that in business consulting, where I had family businesses that the members of the organization hated each other. And I just made them listen to each other's stories of what they thought was important. And they still disagreed with each other, but the fact that they were able to understand the sincerity of somebody else's point of view allowed them to work together. And that first step is a step of generosity in order to be able to have that kind of a dialogue. So that really resonated with me when you were talking there at the end. I think we're getting pretty well close to the end there, but is there any final comments that you would like to make, or parting thoughts that you would like to share with us before we conclude this, Jer?
Yes, that last piece on listening and listening to yourself as well as to others. You find if you say, okay, listen, like that's the role of a leader. There are three things that my mentors have always taught me, like listen deeply. So it isn't just faux listening to give them their 5 to 10 minutes and then they go on for 20. It's like listen deeply to what's really there from your stance of compassion and empathy. Speak responsibly, communicate responsibly. You own your words and you own where you stand. And also not to be silent during those tough Thanksgiving meals where you need to shift, let's say, or disrupt disempowering conversations, where violence is showing up in language, racism, sexism, ableism. The isms show up all sorts. It's not to be a strident, turd in a punch bowl, at Thanksgiving, that you're always like interrupting or correcting. It just means owning it, going back to speaking responsibility, and were you hearing? the ability to stand in our values and to know who you are, that's what we have so much in common with. Are we speaking and listening from a place of compassion and empathy, justice, peace, shared universal human values, and recognizing that dignity in each and every person in front of you, of that individual? So that was one thing. And lastly, you know, I was thinking on the other piece of like, oh yeah, just go out and be resilient. It's like going to the gym. But you know, like, I don't feel like it. Like, it's sort of like there's all these shoulds. You know, why do we have to, like, we have to listen deeply, we have to do this, we got to build our resilience, and you're just like, I'm just tired. And so this idea, but you know that when you do get off your ass and go to the gym, it's after the fact, or, you know, go out into nature or off for a run, you feel better. Again, serotonin up, you have, it's healthy. So making healthy choices is it. But lastly, resilience is still performative. As I mentioned, you can build your resilience as largely things you can do and, you know, experience socially as well. But this last piece I'd leave you with, which is like, if you don't have the practice of breathing or you don't go into nature and you don't practice silence, then that's also the secret sauce. Like, you have the 5 steps, but the 6th one is relax, enjoy, show that, you know, very compassion to yourself. So when I say, you know, my name is Jerry, or I stand for compassion, it's for myself and for all others. You know, you don't leave out that sister or that cousin or that ex-colleague. You stand for humanity. And so just practicing that, the sense of being in balance and in love, I find that it's not really as hard. We've forgotten it, we buried it somehow, like just our very breath and our misalignment with nature. So when in doubt, like, go out and walk and just like sit under a tree. I mean, these are so like almost cliche things to do, but I find that yes, build your resilience, but in fact, to go the distance and to be able to deeply listen, you have to have deeply listened in silence, you know, to yourself, so you also feel heard, and deeply listen to creation and nature, where you know, develop humility and like how small we are in the scope of this grand experiment.
Very good. Thanks very much. So thank you, Jerry, for a great conversation as always today. For those of you who are following along on this vlog, next month our guest will be Kristen Hahn, who is a movie producer and screenwriter in Los Angeles, and another longtime friend of mine. Most recently, she's the executive producer of Apple TV's The Morning Show with Jennifer Aniston and Reese Witherspoon. And just to tie a little bit to what we've been talking today, since we talked a little bit about, talked a fair amount about religion, Kristen wrote one of the most interesting lay introductions to comparative spirituality that I've ever read. It's called In Search of Grace, where she spent 2.5 years just going around to different religious groups in the United States and learning about them. And since she's not an expert, she's able to relate it in a way that is just a great introduction. And so, you know, in terms of increasing spiritual and religious literacy, to piggyback on some of the things that we were talking about a little bit earlier, I'd recommend that book as a supplement to some of the things we've been talking about today. So thank you again, Jerry. I look forward to future conversations as always, and we'll see you all again next month.